Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Beyond the Cage. I'm your host, Jim Graham. On today's program, or tonight's program, I really should say, going to go over some UFC fight recaps, Ultimate Fighter Finale 25, UFC 213, and UFC Fight Night Glasgow. And I'm also going to talk about Bellator 181. You can follow me on Twitter at Jim Graham, and you can also like Beyond the Cage on Facebook at facebook.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. I also would like to thank MMA Fighting Club for hosting the live stream of Beyond the Cage. And for anyone that is watching live, feel free to comment below and add your questions to the broadcast, and I will comment and answer them as it moves along. And also thank you to everyone watching later on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. Check out that for the latest videos for Beyond the Cage, including my latest show previewing UFC Long Island, as well as interviewing not Kelvin Gastelum, he's in the main event of UFC Long Island, but interviewing Jimmy Rivera, who is fighting on the main card there for UFC on Fox this weekend. So you can check out that video right now on YouTube, youtube.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. Going to start first what happened first, and that was the Ultimate Fighter Finale 25. That was Friday, July 7th from Las Vegas. That was at the T-Mobile Arena. 6 fights were shown on the main card, and it ended up kicking off. That was in the light heavyweight division. Jordan Johnson against Marcel Fortuna. And looking at this matchup, it was a very close fight. Both guys definitely had their moments. Could definitely tell that after his debut and knockout win over Anthony Hamilton, that Fortuna was definitely falling in love, with those power shots. And early on, I thought was very hesitant to throw a lot of combinations. I think you could tell that he was really trying to land some big bombs. And I think that early activity by Johnson, I think, definitely gave him that first round. You can just tell he threw 45 strikes to just 24 for Fortuna, and Johnson also was successful on 1 takedown out of 2 attempts. Second round, that's when Fortuna started to pick up the pace and really land some of those power punches as he outstruck Johnson 33-15. Johnson did have a takedown mixed in there, and that round ended up being very close. And I probably would have gave it to Fortuna. Looking at third round, again, this one, again, ultra close. Fortuna slightly outstriking Johnson 17-16. Neither was able to land a takedown. You could tell both were kind of tired at that point. When it was all said and done, Fortuna did outstrike Johnson 62-47. However, Johnson had those 2 takedowns, 1 in the first and 1 in the second. And I think those takedowns and that early activity is what gave the judges the unanimous decision, 29-28 on all 3 scorecards in favor of the American Jordan Johnson. And I really think that Fortuna, had he not kind of laid back a little bit in that first round, probably could have won it. And for Johnson, I think he showed some pretty good stand-up, decent wrestling, and maybe just work on the conditioning just a bit and tighten up the defense and the striking. But overall, a really solid fight, a really close fight, but neither guy, I hate to say completely stood out. I think Johnson does have some potential, but he'll have to tighten things up if he wants to move on. And for Fortuna, like I said, he's definitely going to have to not give away rounds, because that definitely cost him in this fight. Next fight on the card there for the Ultimate Fighter 25 finale moved to the middleweight division as Brad Tavares took on Elias Theodore. And I knew this would be a tight, close fight. I knew it would probably go 3 rounds. Neither guy is really known for their finishing ability. And looking over at the stats, obviously very close. 34 landed strikes for Tavares to 64 for Theodore. Theodore was successful on only 3 takedowns of his 7 attempts, and also Tavares had a takedown mixed in there. Looking at this fight, first round was really close. Tavares actually landed a takedown on Theodore officially and slightly outstruck by the Canadian 17-13. Very close fight. I think you could have gave Tavares that round. third round definitely had to be Elias, as he outstruck the Hawaiian 35-18 in that frame and did land a takedown. And then in round 3 there, we see Theodore get 2 takedowns, only land 12 strikes, but the difference was the couple times Tavares was able to reverse, it seems like he got better position, had the back at one point, and that was kind of a back-and-forth round, but it seemed like Tavares was starting to kind of get the better of some of those grappling exchanges, and you could tell that he's really improved on the ground. And I think maybe that surprised Theodore, who, again, even though he only attempted 7 takedowns, which you would think maybe is rather low for him, he had to work hard in those 7 attempts. Tavares was not making it easy, and I think towards the end there, I think Tavares showed that he had a lot of heart and still had a lot left in the gas tank, and he was able to take that third round in what was a very close fight. I mean, that's just how it is with Elias, because he doesn't put too many people away, and really neither does Tavares, but this was going to be a tough fight just with the style that Elias brings. Tavares is able to string it out and get the victory. I actually did pick Bragg Tavares. This was a tough fight to pick, but I thought Tavares would do what he did. I thought he would be relatively hard to take down and wouldn't stay standing. He definitely would be the better striker. And I wouldn't say he was overly the better striker as I initially thought. I thought Elias did well on the feet, but I think Tavares surprised me and probably a lot of people with his grappling skills, especially against the guy as skilled as Elias Theodore. All right, let's go to the next fight of the evening here, and that's going to be, let's see here, give me 1 second, lost my place there for a second. That's in the light heavyweight division as Jared Cannonier took on Nick Roach. I believe Roach took this fight on about a week short notice, I think they were saying on the broadcast there with Brian Stan, and that showed a little bit, but overall, I didn't think he stood much of a chance against Jared Cannonier. I think Jared Cannonier is a very skilled individual, a very powerful dude, just an overall better striker, and really he just overwhelmed Roach right from the start. I mean, 25-10 outstruck him in the first round. He was kind of settling in the second round. To me, is really where he started to pick things up and really started to hurt Nick, outstriking him 47-15. Also credited with the takedown in there, and he was very close to finishing him towards the end of the second round. It went to the third. Cannonier picked up right where he left off, was able to finish with a series of elbows from the ground. And that was all she wrote there. Big John McCarthy had to come and stop this one at 2:08 in the third round. And what can you say? Jared Cannonier gets a bounce-back victory. He beats a guy he should beat, and he finishes him. I think that's the most important thing. When you get guys that you should beat in the sport, is that you go ahead and you finish them. And that's exactly what Jared Cannonier did. After the fight, he called out Gohan Saki, which I am definitely a fan of, and I think that would be an excellent fight, not only just for Saki but also for Cannonier. So I hope that's what get booked next. I don't know if Saki's going to look for someone more high profile, but Jared Cannonier would definitely make an exciting fight. I don't think there's any doubt about it, and I think that's a good way for Saki to get his feet wet, because I believe he only has one mixed martial arts fight to his credit, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that would be a good fight if and when Saki wants to make his debut in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Next fight in the lightweight division, we had two of the big prospects here for the UFC battling it out as hometown guy here for me in Michigan, as Drakkar Klose took on Mark Ducati. And kind of went how I thought it would. I thought that the wrestling of Klose would be hard for the Bone Crusher to deal with. And you add in Klose as a pretty solid striker in his own right. The first round, Drakkar Klose, he had one takedown. Ducati had 2 takedowns out of 3 attempts, but the big difference is striking. Klose outstruck him 36-16. That continued in round 2 with another takedown by Klose, 29-12. And then in round 3, I think the Bone Crusher thought that he probably lost those first 2 rounds, and he started to pick it up a little bit, and he actually outstruck the Michigander 35-19. I think he gave him that 3rd round. He did start to hurt close a little bit, but those first 2 rounds definitely got handled and definitely showed that he has some work to do from a grappling standpoint. And he took on a guy that is competent enough not only in grappling but in striking to neutralize him and give him his first loss. And also you got to add in the fact that he took this thing out of the first round. Bone Crusher's had a lot of first-round finishes. Looking at his UFC tenure, does have a 3-round decision victory over Frankie Perez in his second ever UFC fight, but he does not have too many decisions to his credit. And this was definitely a learning experience. I think in the UFC, you're gonna face guys that are kind of buzzsaws, and I think Dracarkos is that. He's a tough guy. He hits hard. He's not particularly overly big or has a big reach, and he doesn't do anything amazingly well, but he does a lot of the little things right. And that's what I've noticed so far from close. Maybe he talks a little too much trash, and this, especially in this fight, it was definitely heated between these 2 individuals. Definitely a very emotional fight between these 2 gentlemen, and I think that also may have had to play into it as well, because when you get emotional and you make it that sort of thing, that can be draining because you're putting maybe a little more effort than you would have if you didn't care, if you were just simply acting like this is another fight and not really worrying about what your opponent may or may not have said. So I think from standpoint that may have had something to do with the matchup as well. And overall, I did think this was a solid fight. I know there were some boos at some times, but I really thought this was a solid fight. And I think overall, a very smart fight by Close. Other than the 3rd round, I thought he never really let those crazy strikes and those flashy strikes come out from Ducati. And I think that was a big reason why Dracarkos was able to get this victory a couple weeks ago. Next fight of the evening, co-main event, and also for the Ultimate Fighter Redemption Championship. We had 2 guys who, Diego Lima made it to the final of his original season of the Ultimate Fighter, and of course we all know Jesse Taylor was supposed to fight for that championship many seasons ago on the Ultimate Fighter. He was never given that opportunity to do some off the books there. He eventually did obviously get a chance in the UFC against the guy he was supposed to against the guy many thought he was going to fight in CB Dalloway. He got that opportunity, however, squandered that as well, losing to CB Dalloway via Peruvian necktie, and that was his only UFC fight until July 7, 2017, where he took on Diego Lima in the Ultimate Fighter finale. And this is one of the reasons why I picked JT Money to win this. I knew that Diego would have a lot of trouble dealing with the size, strength, and just overall wrestling ability of JT Money. And even though of his 14 losses, of his 15 losses, I think 14 are by submission. And yeah, he's a guy that sometimes, lays on top, and that's why he's got caught in a lot of submissions. It took him a while to really learn the submission game. At this stage, he's a lot stronger in that, and even though Diego does have some submission skills, I wouldn't say he's necessarily a guy that's very tricky off his back. I'd say a lot of his submissions are his striking setting up the submissions. And so if this fight went to the ground, you really had to favor the wrestler and Jesse Taylor, and that's what happened. He really dominated that first round. Second round, Diego came out knowing, okay, I can't let him take him down again. I got to make some time now. Landed a huge punch that sent Taylor flying. Taylor doesn't even remember getting hit. He just remembers being on the floor and said, all right, I got to get up. And he was able to recover just quick enough to grab onto Diego, hold on, and then swoop around, eventually get the back and get the choke there to become the Ultimate Fighter winner. And just a very impressive performance. And I know he's a little older now. He's had 46 professional fights, not including all the fights he's had in the Ultimate Fighter both times and, any amateur fights. But I am excited to see him. I think that his wrestling skill is definitely a force to be reckoned with against anybody in the welterweight division. And I don't think he's going to get to the championship level, but he's definitely going to make some interesting fights. I can tell you that. And he's not that lay and pray guy that we saw very early on in his career when he was first on The Ultimate Fighter. This is a much different guy. This is a guy that is going for finishes with submissions and with strikes. And I think he's going to be fun to watch here for, well, hopefully the next couple of years, as long as he doesn't lose too much. Let's get to the main event, and what a main event it was. Definitely deserving of the fight of the night and performance of the night. Honors Justin Gaethje and Michael Johnson just put on a show in the main event, and I had a feeling this is how this fight was going to go. Both guys are good at wrestling. Both guys have some solid stand-up. Both guys hit very hard, and it was just going to be a matter of who can last more. I mean, this fight didn't even go 10 minutes. And we had a combined 374 strikes. I love it. That is incredible. That's the type of fight, that's the type of pace that I like to see. Not just throwing hard, but throwing punches in bunches, throwing caution to the wind, and just going out there and get it. And both guys tried to get it. And you can't fault them for that. And I think for Johnson, he did throw 26 more strikes, but his punches, he had that early on. He definitely rocked him. But I think that pace, he wasn't used to that much in that amount of time. And I think Gaethje, he was a little more at home with that. And I think that's why towards the second round you really saw Gaethje pull an advantage in this fight. And you saw Johnson try some takedowns, but he got shut down. I mean, Gaethje is a very, very good wrestler. And for those of you who've been watching this program here on MMA Fighting Club and on YouTube, did see that I spoke with Michael Johnson. He said he was really focusing on his wrestling for his camp. He said that was his main focus for his camp, was wrestling. So the fact that that was almost all he was working on, he comes in there and, yeah, he did land a takedown, but for the most part got shut down. I think shows you the testament of how good this kid Justin Gaethje is, and he just wasn't some guy that was beating up bums in World Series of Fighting. This guy is a legit top 10 lightweight in the world, and he's very deserving of getting the Ultimate Fighter coach opposite former champion Eddie Alvarez, and that's going to be a straight-up war. I mean, that was a fight, obviously, if you kind of look at it, Justin Gaethje was, I think, just starting his championship run of World Series of Fighting right as Eddie Alvarez was the Bellator champion and obviously transitioned to the UFC. So this is really cool from that standpoint. You get two guys that were outside the UFC and for a while were the best guys outside the UFC now coming together and coaching on the Ultimate Fighter, I think is amazing. And the winner probably doesn't get a title. Well, I don't think Alvarez gets a title shot if he beats Justin Gaethje. Gaethje maybe could factor in pretty close. However, who knows how long Conor will have this thing tied up if and when they ever actually strip him or create an interim. We all know Tony Ferguson and Habib are probably the top two guys, especially Ferguson, deserving a shot at some type of either actual championship or interim championship or otherwise. But they definitely put on a show, and I think it's also good for Justin Gaethje after a fight like that to take a couple months off, go film The Ultimate Fighter, and wait till December to fight again. And unfortunately, we don't get to see. That means Dustin Poirier against Eddie Alvarez too, them running back after that illegal knee thrown by Eddie Alvarez. But maybe that sets up Dustin Poirier against somebody like a Kevin Lee or a Michael Chiesa, or we could see Poirier Johnson, doubtful, but it's a possibility. Or maybe we'll see Poirier against Habib Nurmagomedov, or Nate Diaz maybe even is still in the picture, I think, if he wants to fight again. So a lot of good fights still happening in this lightweight division, despite Conor going off to Boxing Land and Media Circus Land. All right, that was the Ultimate Fighter finale. Really good night of fights there, and we transitioned to UFC 213, which was the following evening at the same arena, T-Mobile Arena, and that was also in Las Vegas. They nearly doubled the attendance from the previous night. It was only about 6,000 for the Ultimate Fighter finale, checking in at about 12,000 for this one, and of course, I'm sure the Cody-TJ fight not being on that card had to hurt not only attendance but pay-per-view buys, and obviously losing the new main event of Amanda Nunes and Valentina Shevchenko, I'm sure hurt pay-per-view buys even more. It wouldn't have hurt attendance that much because it happened so close. I don't think that many people didn't end up going. I mean, if you're already there and had a ticket, I don't know why you then wouldn't go. You already spent the time and effort to be in Las Vegas for that event, so I don't think it did much for that. However, overall, I think the Ultimate Fight Night or the Ultimate Fighter finale was overall a better fight. I think other than Chad Laprise had a very nice win and knockout over Brian Camusi on the undercard. We also saw Thiago Santos with a big knockout. But, overall, I think that is definitely with the main card. Rather pedestrian. Rob Font, I thought, had a very good performance against Douglas Silva de Andrade. Looked really good, was piecing him up on the feet, decided to take the fight to the ground and get that choke locked in. I thought a very impressive performance. And then he had a lightweight division. Did Anthony Pettis win? Yes, I'm a fan of Anthony Pettis. You can see the Wheaties box over there. But let's not get it twisted. He did beat Jim Miller. Jim Miller's been a guy who has had trouble competing with the elite of this division. Obviously now Jim Miller a little older, so him beating Jim Miller in a fight that was primarily on the feet doesn't surprise me. Now, he did a good job of stopping the takedown. I mean, Miller was only 1 for 4. I think Miller really kind of surprising. He only tried 4 takedowns, to be honest. I think he should have pressed the issue a little more. That's really Anthony's weakness, is guys getting up in his face, putting him against the cage, tying him up, and grinding him. Now, yeah, he's a tricky submission guy, but Jim Miller's really good at submissions too, so you wouldn't think Miller would be afraid of going inside the guard with Pettis, but you just weren't going to get it done standing up. Miller doesn't have those type of boxing skills that I think was really going to trouble the Showtime kicks of Anthony Pettis. And while this fight did have some entertainment, obviously with the blood, and I think Pettis kind of put it on him, especially in rounds 2 and 3. I think he really started to take off. Like I said, Miller didn't have anything for his stand. I mean, outstruck him 107-51 and shut him down on takedowns. I mean, this was a good victory for Anthony Pettis. He did beat a solid guy. It's his re-return to the lightweight division, and it's good from the standpoint because he beat a grappler. He beat a guy that was supposed to come in there, tie him up, take him to the ground, and kind of beat him up that way, and he was able to pass that. So I don't know if he's back to championship form, but this is definitely a step in the right direction. The biggest thing he has to work on, again, is that boxing and boxing defense. Because, yeah, he's a good striker, but he's a good kicker. And that's different. When we saw him lose to Holloway and Barboza, we saw him lose to guys that were superior with their hands. And I think that is still something he's going to have to work on a little bit, because he's probably going to run into one of those two guys again. And luckily for him, Rafael Dos Anjos appears to be out of the division. So one of the guys that gave him obviously a heck of a lot of trouble in their championship match, he's out, so he doesn't have to worry about that. A lot of other guys in the lightweight division are obviously stand-up guys. When you look at Dustin Poirier, Kevin Lee, Michael Chiesa, a lot of interesting fights out there for the former champion coming up, and he definitely is a factor with some of those guys I had mentioned earlier. So, very interested to see him. I think him against Dustin Poirier would be a great matchup for later this year if that can get put together. The third fight of the evening there in Las Vegas, Curtis Blaydes against Daniel Olmenchuk, and this one really was a snoozer. Neither guy, did anything great, and the real sad thing about this fight was the fact that Curtis Blaydes was definitely winning in the stand-up department, something that I didn't think was going to happen. I really thought that Blaydes would be able to take the Polishman down, but he wasn't. I mean, 0 for 13 on the takedowns. But the weird thing about that stat is he's 0 for 13 on takedowns, so you think, oh, he must be getting pieced up on the feet, right? No, he was winning the stand-up battle and winning quite decisively. I mean, he outstruck Olmenchuk 94-68, and he outthrew him 194-149. He actually made it a boring fight, because if he would have just realized maybe after that middle of the second round, like, all right, this dude's tough to take down, I'm piecing him at the feet, I'm just going to stand up on the feet. I mean, at what point, 10th, 11th takedown not working, do you go, all right, this just isn't working? And the thing was, he was winning the fight. He really didn't need to go and get a takedown. I could understand if those numbers were flipped and Olmachuk was getting the striking better of the two, then by all means, yeah, switch to plan B and try to take him down, but there was no reason for him to do that. And he ended up making this a boring fight. Yeah, he got the victory because he was beating him in the feet. And I guess it's good because he developed and showed that he had solid striking, but on the other hand, it's kind of a negative because he was pushing for something that A, wasn't working, and B, he didn't need to do. So when Curtis goes back and looks at this tape, I think he'll hopefully realize, man, I didn't really need to try for 13 takedowns. I think if I would have just kept standing there and punching him, I may have gotten a knockout. But instead, those constant tie-ups dragged on this fight. And, to Olmachuk's credit, he did try to go for it in the third. You could tell he definitely upped his output. Actually threw the most strikes of any one round with 52. Was only labeled to land 21, and he actually tried to take down on Blade's Tear, though. So Olmachuk definitely, tried to amp it up in the third round, but by that point, it, was too little too late. He was, like I said, getting pieced up and obviously tired for having to constantly defend those takedowns of a guy who's an absolute monster. I mean, Curtis Blades is a huge heavyweight. Olmachuk, one of the smaller heavyweights in the division, and he got the win, but yeah, it did not make for a very entertaining fight. Another heavyweight battle in the co-main event, Alistair Overeem against Fabricio Werdum. This one actually wasn't as exciting as I thought it was going to be. For a guy that's really developed, I think, into a very competent striker in Fabricio Werdum, he seemed very hesitant to exchange with Alistair Overeem. And don't get me wrong, Alistair Overeem is a very dangerous guy. He's very powerful, has great kicks and punches, but definitely a guy that later in his career definitely has shown that you can get to him. You can knock him out, and he's not throwing with the same volume that he used to. And for a guy that is more of a volume striker, I thought Werdum would be able to capitalize on that fact, and he was and wasn't. The first round, rather pedestrian. Neither guy really did much of anything. 12 landed strikes for Werdum, 6 for Overeem. You can make a case that Overeem maybe landed a couple more powerful punches. Maybe wobbled Werdum a little bit, but that round was. He even could have scored it a 9-9. Round 2, Werdum didn't get a takedown, but Overeem again slightly outstruck, again 23-16, and Werdum was the more active guy. But again, Overeem landing the more powerful strikes once again, and I think that swayed the judges. Then in round 3, a complete wipeout for Fabricio Werdum. Around that, I think you could make a case for a 10-8. One judge did have it a 10-8 there in favor of Werdum, which he scored at a draw. That was Derek Clearly. He had a 28-28, and I think that's fair. I mean, he outstruck him 72-7 in the takedown and completely washed him out. I don't disagree with scoring that a 10-8, and this fight very easily could have been scored a draw. And for Overeem, it's a win, but let's not act like he went in there and dominated Fabricio Werdum. This really wasn't a great fight by either. I mean, when you go back and look at the stats, and everyone's going, oh, stats are deceiving and all that, but when you go back and look, I know the wipeout there in the third round really inflates these numbers, but still, he got outstruck 107-29. He only threw 46 strikes to 176 for Fabricio Werdum, and he walks away with a unanimous decision victory, or a majority decision victory. When you go back and look at the stats like that, and also Werdum had a takedown, that the one takedown he landed the third. It's actually quite amazing that Overeem even won this fight. It really is. And I don't super disagree with it, because the first round, again, was pedestrian. The second round, I think, was clearly Overeem, and the third round was clearly Werdum. It's how you scored that first round, and obviously whether you scored the third round a 10-8. So I wouldn't have had a problem if that fight ended a draw, because at the end of the day, no one really, other than that third round, no one really super stood out. And Werdum can protest, fans can say, well, if this was been back in Pride, like, some of the first fight, Werdum would have won because, he ended that third round. Yeah, that's all fine and great, but here's the thing. We're not in Pride anymore. We're in the UFC, and these are the rules. Like them or not, That's what they are right now. Maybe they will change it from a round-to-round boxing-based scoring and do a more prize-style scoring. Maybe they will, but right now, that's not what they're doing, and that's not how you win fights currently. And unfortunately for Fabricio Werdum, he wasn't strong enough in the other 2 rounds to sway the judges to give him this fight. Yeah, he had a very dominant 3rd round, but again, having that dominant 3rd round, even if this would have ended up a draw, it does nothing for him, and it does nothing for Overeem at the end of the day, because I don't think Overeem's going to get the next title shot. He shouldn't get the next title shot. The only way he does is if Cain Velasquez truly cannot go anytime soon. And there's also the fact that Stipe Miocic wants to restructure his contract so he gets paid a little more, and deservingly so. The champion should get paid as equal, if not more, than the challenger. And the last 2 fights, when he actually was champion, not fighting for the championship, he got paid less than his challenger, that being Junior Dos Santos and Alistair Overeem. So I think that is an issue. Now, I've seen conflicting reports. I've seen that, yes, they're going to fight in October. No, they're not. Yes, they are. I don't know. It looks as though they are. Regardless, I hope that fight happens because I think that's the matchup to make. He's already fought Werdum. He's already fought Overeem. He's already fought Junior Dos Santos. He's already fought Mark Hunt, and he's beat those guys. Those are the other real big top guys. The only guy he hasn't faced is Ngannou, but we know Ngannou is going to be fighting Junior Dos Santos at UFC 215. Ngannou beats Dos Santos, and he's beaten Orlovsky as well. So if Ngannou gets by Junior Dos Santos, Ngannou, I would assume, gets the next title shot, and I think should jump Alistair Overeem. The fact this wasn't a great performance by Overeem, I think we could see Overeem possibly rematch Mark Hunt. That was a very close fight up until that 3rd round. Or we could see Overeem maybe get a rematch against Ben Rothwell. Is out there as well. I don't know. We shall see, but I think Overeem just waits, and that's totally up to him. But I think the Cain fight is really what intrigues me because it's the only top heavyweight left that Stipe either A, hasn't fought, or B, hasn't beat. And so I think that is the fight to make next, and hopefully that does go down in October. All right, the main event of the evening, or the new main event, Robert Whittaker against Yoel Romero. This was definitely fight of the night. And this, to me, this was a championship fight. When you go back and look at great championship fights, I think this is a prime example. And also a prime example of championship performances and guys rising to the occasion. Because this was a fight where Yoel Romero, had a lot of power, a lot of ability, and definitely was a bigger guy, and is just an all-around just scary dude. And the first 2 rounds he definitely took. I think there's no doubt about it. The first round was close, but Romero did outstrike him 14-7. Did have one of his 4 takedowns mixed in there. The second round, Romero pushed a little more for the takedown. 6 attempts, landed 2 of them. Never had a huge time on top, but landed some ground and pound, got some striking too, especially with those leg kicks that he was throwing in those first 2 rounds. You could definitely tell was affecting the Aussie Whittaker. Outstruck him 49-10. Then, all of a sudden, I don't know if it's just that he expended too much energy on those takedowns in the first 2 rounds, or if he was just trying to pace himself more, but there was definitely a noticeable difference in Romero in rounds 3 through 5. And I think a lot of people, myself included, thought that if Romero didn't finish this fight in the first 2 rounds, the final 3 rounds would definitely favor Robert Whittaker, a guy who had fought at 170, so obviously a little smaller of a middleweight. You would consider him the better condition of the two, considering how massive and muscular Romero is. Definitely not a guy that's really built for 25 minutes. But you saw Whittaker, I think the leg kicks really affected him in round 3. Now, he threw 53 strikes, but only landed 13. So Romero was missing a lot of those strikes. He was pushing for takedowns, not getting them. Then you saw, I think, Whittaker start to get more confidence. Landed 19 strikes. So, stuffed. That was the last takedown Romero was successful on, 1 of 4. And, I think really started to get more confident and realized that he was the stronger guy. Or not the stronger guy, but he was the fresher guy. He had the better conditioning. Heading into that 5th round, I think he felt really confident. And I think Romero also sensed that, he needed to do something too, that he probably dropped those 2 rounds consecutively, and both guys just went at it. I mean, Whittaker nearly outstriking Romero 45-38, but I think a lot of those Whittaker was able to get away with a lot out of the way. A lot of those, had stuff to take down, and was able to put together an amazing championship performance. I mean, stopping a guy who's arguably the best wrestler to ever be in the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and stop him, on 14 attempts. Was successful stopping him 14 of 18 times. I think, you do that, he had a chance to win the fight, because if it stays standing, even though you maybe give a slight edge to Power Romero, overall striking you had to favor with the Australian. Also, the output he kept out there. I mean, he threw 244 strikes. That's a really good clip. 175 for Romero. Romero landed a little bit more, and that was due to that early and big gap that he had there in round 2. But definitely thought that Whittaker earned this fight, earned this victory. It wasn't a bad performance by Romero, but definitely shows that because he had to pace himself, he definitely was not the same guy down the stretch. And also, he went away from those leg kicks. I don't know why he did that. He was very successful with those kind of Winklejohn S-Camp, side kicks to the leg that he was throwing in the first 2 rounds, which I've never seen him throw before. You could tell really affect Romero, who after the fight said that he had an injury leading up to this camp that was good, but those leg kicks kind of re-injured it, and he said that it was severely affecting him. You add that all in, and he was still able to stuff 14 takedowns of Romero. This is one of the all-time great championship performances, and I'm just super impressed by this kid, Robert Whittaker. I know I picked Yoel Romero, but man, I think that if the Jacare fight wasn't his coming out party, I mean, this certainly was. I mean, there's no bigger time. Championship fight, main event of a pay-per-view. You're down 2 rounds to none, and you're able to put a performance like that against one of the scariest dudes in any division. I mean, I don't know if we'll see too many more great championship performances like that, ever. I mean, that was a classic championship performance. If you want to tell people how to fight a championship fight and how to be a cage fighter and how to go in there and just do what you got to do despite whether you're hurting or how tough or how good the other guy is, show them this fight of Robert Whittaker against Yoel Romero. That was a very inspiring performance and very deserving of the interim championship. And with that performance, I think he will beat Michael Bisping. I really do, because Bisping now at this stage in his career, he's a guy that doesn't move around quite as well. He's not quite as fast. He's not quite as strong. He's not. He doesn't take the hits quite as well. And his conditioning is not quite what it once was. It's still really good, but it's still he's starting to kind of get out of the prime. We're talking about a guy starting to get into his late 30s. Whittaker's in the prime of his career. I don't know. I mean, it was apparent, I think, to a lot of people that Bisping didn't want anything to do with Yoel Romero. But after seeing this fight, I don't know if you want anything to do with Robert Whittaker. So if I was Michael Bisping, you definitely want to angle for that GSP fight. If I were him, because right now I don't know if you want to face Robert Whittaker. He's a very, very confident young man and a guy who is very skilled and hits like a truck as well. And I'm very interested to see how that fight plays out. And whenever that fight happens, I think I'm already pre-picking Robert Whittaker for that matchup later on this year, hopefully. All right. That was UFC 213. Once again, I'm your host, Jim Graham. You can follow me on Twitter at Jim Graham. This is the show Beyond the Cage, and I'd like to thank MMA Fighting Club for hosting the original live stream of this broadcast. As I'm moving on here to Bellator 181. Had 4 fights shown on the main card. Kicked off with Joe Warren against Steve Garcia. What do you think? This was a Joe Warren fight. Joe Warren fought someone who's not an elite guy. No offense to Steve Garcia. Not ready for a guy the caliber of Joe Warren. And he got wrestled. Plain and simple. That's what Joe Warren can do to people. And that's what happened. Was that last Friday from Oklahoma. Plain and simple. Honestly, Warren should retire. I really don't know why he's still fighting. I mean, yeah, he can beat he can beat non-elite guys, but he's not beating Dantes. He's not beating Valgo. He's not beating Darren Caldwell. I don't even think he could beat Leandro Higa. I mean, I don't know if he needs the money. I don't know. I think he would be a guy that you definitely would want to work with as far as a coach goes, but I don't know. And also a guy that does, like a mini. I always consider him kind of like a mini Chael Sonnen. I know they got a lot of people in the broadcast booth now. Marlo Ronaldo actually announced this fight with Jimmy Smith. Would be interesting to see him do some stuff. Obviously, they kind of had like a studio thing there. I know that was the big Bellator pay-per-view, but that may be something that we maybe see the evolution of Bellator having kind of a studio thing like that. Maybe he's a guy that could factor in on that. But I mean, not only that, that wasn't a very exciting fight too. No one really wanted to see that. I don't think, even for an area that is known for wrestling, like Oklahoma State University, not being too far. But yeah. Anyways, moving on to the next fight, female fight, flyweight division, Emily Ducati against Jessica Middleton. Ducati, obviously the hometown girl there in Thackerville, and had a very good performance. I mean, besides her loss in what was a very close fight to Ilya McFarland back in December of last year, she's now 4-1 in the flyweight division. I think she absolutely factors in to a potential either tournament or flyweight championship fight. And while this wasn't the flashiest victory, obviously, it's not her armbar over, Kenya Miranda da Silva or her rear naked choke win in the first round there against Katie Collins. It is a victory nonetheless. And Jessica Middleton is, a very game individual, girl who definitely, had some good wins, had beat Alice Yager and Bruna Ellen, which actually were her first ever 2 professional bouts. Then, of course, did get submitted and lost to Ilya. So, obviously, a girl that, had some skill, had beat some, decent fighters. But, I obviously still learning. Obviously, Ducati has a lot more experience as a professional, and I think it showed in there, despite being, a little smaller, 5'7" to Ducati's 5'2". You could just tell that Middleton's not quite there on the skill level, especially in the grappling, and she was able to pretty much take her down and hold her there, and Middleton didn't really have much of an answer for that, and Ducati walks away with the victory, and I think soon, I think they got to announce something with the flyweight division and also with the heavyweight division of Bellator. I think something's got to be done. I think you can't have girls and good quality men for the heavyweight side fighting just to fight. There's got to be that payoff of chasing that dream and becoming a world champion. All the other divisions have a championship, but these two. And I'd like to think, hopefully later this year, maybe on the same exact card, that we get a champion decided in some way, shape, or form, either just by a straight-out announcement, hey, these 2 girls are fighting, these 2 guys are fighting for heavyweight, or some type of mini tournament that culminates in a championship fight. But I think something's got to be decided soon here. Next fight of the evening, John Salter against Kendall Grove. And John Salter, he's a guy that definitely I think people should start paying attention to. He really bursted onto the scene, submitting Dustin Jacoby in January 2015, and then his submission of Brandon Halsey. I think that was kind of his coming out party. Nobody expected him to win that fight. He was a guy that was, definitely not favored to win that fight, and he was able to pull off the victory there. He comes back, knocks out Anchario in the first round, and then now puts it to Kendall Grove, taking it right to a very dangerous submission guy, a very good jiu-jitsu practitioner, Kendall Grove, and was able to submit him in the first round. That's no joke, even though obviously Grove, definitely on the downside of his career, but still a guy I would consider a very good submission guy and always a tricky guy to deal with because of his height. And to go out there and submit him in the first round is awfully impressive. He's now won 6 consecutive fights. 4 of them have been in the Bellator cage with those 4 victories all by finish. And so I think he puts his name on a very short list to challenge Rafael Carvalho for the middleweight championship. Newly signed Gegard Mousasi has already penned a fight against former Bellator middleweight champion Alexander Shlemenko for October. I think he then puts Salter against Carvalho, and the winner of that faces the winner of Shlemenko and Gegard Mousasi. I think that's how it should work. Carvalho hasn't fought in a couple of months, and I don't think Salter here took too much of a damage. I mean, this was only his second fight this year. He fought all the way back in January, so I'd imagine he would be good to go for October, November this year. And time-wise, with the Mousasi fight already being scheduled for October, I think timing-wise works perfect for those 2 winners to face off eventually for the championship. For those of you who don't know, John Salter is a guy who actually did fight a few times in the UFC. Did take on some tough competition. Gerald Harris, Dan Miller. Did have the one win against Jason McDonald, which was a leg injury, so he got cut. Did fight for Strikeforce once. I had a win over Caleb Starnes. Outside the UFC, and since then has really been on a roll. And he's training with Derek Brunson there in North Carolina, and you can definitely see a vast improvement for the guy that went 1-2 in the UFC, and now I think is on the cusp of potentially becoming a Bellator champion. I think he definitely would be a very tough matchup for Carvalho. Main event of the evening, boy, a trilogy fight. I don't know we ever really thought we would see, but much like the other 2, I mean, this was a very entertaining fight. I mean, of these 3 fights that these 2 gentlemen had, every one was entertaining. I mean, there was no shortage of entertainment. They first met back as part of a tournament, I believe, in June of 2013. Seeing Derek Campos get the victory, they then rematched at Bellator 146, seeing Gertz, get the flash knockout there in just 37 seconds, which is crazy considering their first fight went to 3 rounds, and then here in the second fight, just an absolute war for 10 minutes. Both guys throwing caution to the wind, no defense, just straight up brawling. There wasn't a lot of grappling, and a big knee by Derek Campos opened up a huge cut on the forehead of Brandon Gertz. I believe it was towards the end of the first round. The fight continued into the second with that cut still bleeding quite profusely. In between, the doctors, I think this was like their second or third look at that cut, finally decided to stop it, and the cut was definitely dripping into his eyes. I think that was a fact. You could see it, dripping down. It looked relatively big. I think Gertz was good to continue. Campos was good to continue, but fighter safety is definitely paramount, and that cut wasn't going to get any better the way these 2 were fighting. And I understand why it was stopped, and it was definitely a little anticlimactic because I don't know how you judge that fight. I don't know what the score would have been, maybe 1-1, 2-0, but it was definitely entertaining, and definitely we could have seen a finish by either side in that third, or something crazy was going to happen. But Derek Campos gets the victory. I wouldn't be opposed to a fourth, which is crazy to think. I actually really would not be opposed to a fourth victory. But we'll see. But for Derek Campos, that's a big victory for him. After losing to Michael Chandler and Brandon Gertz, he has now rattled off 4 straight victories over the likes of Derek Anderson, Melvin Gillard, and Brandon Gertz. I know Primus and Chandler are going to have to rematch, and I think that has to happen first before Primus defends his title against anybody else. But I think Derek Campos puts himself in a very good position, possibly to take on the winner of Ben Henderson and Pitbull, coming up later this year. I think Campos puts himself, into that conversation. And, after a fight like this, he's definitely an entertaining guy. He's definitely going to be a guy you want to watch no matter who he's against. One thing I want to mention, though, here with, Bellator, they had a couple of, I think, relatively big names fight on, like, the undercard here. They had Amanda Bell, the lady killer, former Invicta fighter, who's fought the likes of Megan Anderson, Charmaine Tweet, and Faye Van Duyn. She actually made her Bellator debut, knocking out Brittany Elkin in the second round. If you look at Sheerdog, that was actually after the main event, so they actually had a few fights after the televised portion had ended. And also, we saw Justin Lawrence fight. He took on Tristan Thomason, and he was able to win via TKO doctor stoppage in the first round after his fight. He last fought actually back in December, so it's been a while since we've seen Justin Lawrence fight when he lost to John Teixeira, who is an incredible fighter, a guy that definitely is one of the top featherweights that Bellator has to offer. So interesting guys to kind of have fight on like the non-televised portion. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. All right, let's move on. Last thing I'm going to cover here on the broadcast. Again, thanks to everybody for tuning in here on MMA Fighting Club Live, or of course watching the non-live version on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. Going to talk about UFC Fight Night Glasgow, which was this past Sunday from Glasgow, Scotland, and some really great finishes on this card. You saw the Pantoja Siri fight with Pantoja submitting Neil Siri. Neil Siri, that was his last fight. Long time veteran there in the UK scene, fighting at flyweight and bantamweight, and he definitely went out with an entertaining fight. And Pantoja's a really tough individual, definitely a guy that is one of the future bright prospects here for this division. We also saw the crazy knockout slam by Galora Buffando against Charlie Ward, something that was definitely kind of almost accidental. They're both in the clinch up against the cage, and you kind of just see Buffando just throw, or Buffando rather, just throw Ward to the ground, and then his head bouncing off the canvas. Definitely not a move or a thing you see too often. Guys' head bounce off the canvas. Ward definitely dazed. A few more on the ground, and that was it. It was, I hate to say it was a fluke, but kind of was a little fluky. I mean, he took advantage of it, but that just shows you the power this dude has, and definitely very excited to see him again. He showed a lot of crazy kicks and stuff, and kind of like a bigger Bruce Leroy is kind of what I like in Buffando too, and I'm interested to see him again in the welterweight division. Also, Danny Roberts, impressive performance against a very big and strong wrestler in Bobby Nash, a guy I know very well, Michigan guy from right here in Metro Detroit. But yeah, very impressive performance by Danny Roberts as well there. As we get to the main card here, 6 fights on the main card kicked off in the heavyweight division. Justin Willis against James Mulholland. Not a great fight this one was. This was not a great kickoff fight to the main card. Justin Willis gets the victory. He was simply better than Mulholland, but I mean, he didn't do anything to really stand out in this fight. I mean, he was never really close to a finish. He landed 3 takedowns, landed a few more strikes, but just, I mean, now I don't know. I wasn't very impressed with Justin Willis. I know they kind of mentioned on the broadcast there with Dan Hardy, how, he trains with Daniel Cormier and those guys, Cain Velasquez out there at AKA, but I don't know. You have to go back to training with those guys, because those guys go out there and finish it and are guys that never stop. I didn't see that from this guy, so I don't know. Khalil Roundtree moving on here against Paul Craig, the Bear Jew, obviously from Scotland. He was the crowd favorite there, but there's one thing Khalil Roundtree can do is throw, and throw hard, and yeah, that's what he did. Some huge strikes, courtesy of Khalil, and the Bear Jew just never really got into a rhythm. He was able to land, I think they said, credited with landing 17 strikes, but you could definitely tell was not throwing as hard as Roundtree and wasn't throwing as often. And when you were going to keep things standing, keep things in that domain, you're going to give Khalil a chance to unleash one of those bombs, and that's what happened. I mean, he only tried 1 takedown. I realize that this fight ended just before the first round, but that's how you got to beat Khalil. And if you're going to, stand in range and maybe try to move in out, maybe do some cute things, I don't think that's going to work. This guy is very strong. He's very powerful, and he's very quick for being, such a muscular guy. So not a guy you want to mess around with on the feet. And I think, Paul Craig learned that the very hard way there in Glasgow. Next fight of the evening, Jack Marshman against Ryan James. It was an all-right fight. Marshman, the Welshman, I think definitely was the aggressor very early in this fight. I mean, he threw 83 strikes to just 58 for James. I think that tenacity really got him the first round, and definitely you could tell he was the harder hitter of the two. In round two, both guys were very active. You actually saw James outstrike Marshman 44-29, but again, that power striking, I think, probably gave Marshman that round. In the round three, Marshman definitely started to slow down a bit. I mean, he threw over 150 strikes in those first two rounds, and because a lot of those were very hard, powerful shots, you saw James, who's the much more punches and bunches types, him really start to take over. He threw 94 strikes in that round and landed 48, outstriking the Welshman 48-29, and I thought had won that round, but I didn't think did enough to win the first two, and no surprise to hear 29-28 in all three cards. And really the difference was the power striking in those first two rounds. And James, for a guy that they said is more of a submission guy, tried for no takedowns in this fight, and I find that awfully surprising. Not even one. And I think especially in those first two rounds when you could tell, a couple power shots land, change things up, change levels, grab for a leg, grab for a clinch, and mostly this was played at range on the feet, and I think that really suited Marshman a lot more. And even though he ended up landing about 40 less strikes, James never landed anything hugely powerful or anything that was really close to ending the fight, and that really ended up being the difference in why Marshman got the victory there over Ryan James. Next fight of the evening, Paul Felder against Stevie Ray. I tell you what, I like Paul Felder. I've always been a fan of his, a fan of Ray as well, but I think the momentum Ray had coming into this fight, beating Joe Lazzone, his first fight over in the United States, away from the UK, taking on a very accomplished pro like Lazzone, who has fought in the UFC so many times now, for him to go in there and beat a guy like that in kind of a comeback fashion, after kind of losing that first round, fighting in his home country, I really thought, this would be a chance for Stevie Ray to really come close to breaking into the top 15. But Paul Felder had other plans. A guy that I think, has competed with some of the elite in this division, already, taking on guys like, Edson Barboza, Ross Pearson, Josh Berkman, Francisco Trinaldo, a guy who's taken on some of the top guys in his division, has faltered, had lost to Pearson, had lost to Barboza, was able to beat tough guys like Cruikshank and Berkman. Obviously kind of got dominated in that fight against Trinaldo, but, since that fight against Trinaldo has really come back and looked absolutely fantastic, knocking out Alessandro Ricci back in February and now knocking out Stephen Ray with an elbow that kind of came out of nowhere. And Stevie Ray, a guy that I believe only had one loss in his career before this fight and certainly had never been finished before. Oh, no, that's wrong. Stevie Ray's listed at 21-7. Well, he hasn't been finished in a very long time. That I do know. I'd have to go back and look to see when exactly that was. But a very tough dude, and he was able to put him away in the first round. I think this is actually. I think that's his most impressive performance to date. I think considering everything going around, Ray was on a roll. Being the bad guy fighting, in his home country, I think that was just a fantastic performance. You add in, I believe they said his he had a death in his family leading up to this. I believe it was his father. All that going on for him to go in there and be able to get a victory like that against a tough guy like Stevie Ray on the road, so to speak. incredible performance and very deserving. I believe he got one of the Performance of the Night bonus honors, and very deserving for the Irish Dragon, Paul Felder, who now improves to 14-3 in his career and is riding a 2-fight win streak and has won 4 out of his last 5 fights. Let's get to the co-main event of the evening, the Scotswoman Joanne Calderwood taking on one of the young up-and-coming girls in the strawweight division, and Cynthia Cavallo. Was training some at AK, now, at least for this camp, training with Team Alpha Male in Sacramento. Looked a little off in this fight. Not the same tenacity that we really saw in her previous 2 performances against Amanda Cooper and Pearl Gonzalez. A little bit more reserved Cynthia Cavallo, and really, it was surprising because the blueprint to really beat Joanne Calderwood is go at her, make it a brawl, don't make it, more of a point fighting, at range type of fight. You got to get in there, get in her face, and preferably take her down. She is a girl that's got submitted a few times, and being a submission expert like Cavallo, I really thought she was going to push the takedowns, and really didn't do that. She did a little bit in the first round, trying for 2, landing 1 towards about maybe a minute and a half towards the end of the round. I think that probably gave her the round. It was very close on the feet, and she did land some damage there. Ended up edging Calderwood 23-18. Round 2 was definitely all Calderwood. They both were even with 20 strikes landed, but Calderwood pushed the pace a lot more. 66 thrown strikes. Cavallo was not successful on her takedown attempt, and that being at range, that's JoJo's game. She can do that all day, and if you're going to do that, she's probably going to beat you at that. That's just what her bread and butter is. That's how she's been successful in her career. And then in round 3, we saw Calderwood start out doing more of the same. However, Cynthia gets another takedown towards the end of the round, throws some damage, comes close to a submission as well. And, man, that third round was super close. But again, Cavallo was probably closer to getting a finish once again, and I think that swayed the judges, and that's why we saw, the scores we did in favor of Cavallo. I will say, however, I don't think a lot of people had a disagreement with Cavallo winning, because I think other than the second round, where that I think was clearly Calderwood, you can make a case for both fighters in the first and the third. However, I don't see how 2 judges, Powell Hersam and Marcy Moleski, if I said that correctly, had it 30-27 for Cavallo. I really don't. It kind of bothered me, to be honest, even though I picked Cynthia to win, thought she had won that fight, but I thought she had won at 29-28. I don't know how 30-27 ever entered the equation. And after the fight, Cynthia did go to the hospital for a little bit, and I don't know if it was a bad weight cut, if she had been feeling ill and all, but you could definitely tell it wasn't quite the same Cynthia. And with her going to the hospital, I can kind of see why, because maybe she wasn't quite 100%. And for Calderwood, yeah, it's disappointing, but at the end of the day, Cynthia was closer to finishing the fight on a few occasions with submissions and was throwing the powerful punches. Yeah, you won round 2, and that's awesome, but rounds 1 and 3 were kind of open to interpretation. And unfortunately for Calderwood, it didn't go her way. A lot of people talking about her jumping up to 125, where she did fight the first ever 125 fight, defeating Valerie Returno, knocking out the Canadian, and that's probably going to be the future for her. I think she's a little better for that weight. She's still going to be a big flyweight. She has a very long frame, and I think that's just going to suit her well with the conditioning, and maybe also add some more power. Maybe she won't have to worry about pacing herself, and I think that may do better for her career, jumping up to 125. But for Cynthia, yeah, it's a victory. Does move her up the rankings, but she's definitely going to probably need another victory or 2 mixed in there before we get to talking about a serious title contender. To the main event, controversy for the main event too, as Santiago Ponzinibbio took on Gunnar Nelson. Controversy being a couple different eye pokes. It also looked like there was kind of a short pull there in a moment. However, when I watched this thing fast motion, you don't really notice the eye pokes, and you really don't notice Nelson acting like he got poked in the eye. Now, you go back, you'll see the stills, you'll see the screenshots. I'm not denying that eye pokes didn't happen, but I'm saying if you watch the thing fast motion and you're going to catch the 3 or 4 eye pokes, I don't think you see them. I don't blame the ref for not seeing them. And as much as I hate to say it, Gunnar Nelson not acting like he got poked in the eye also, I hate to say a guy has to sell it, but sometimes you do. And definitely a learning lesson, because when you kind of react like you just got punched in the face, was what it looked like, the referee's just going to allow that to continue. Especially when you have one guy rushing in, throwing punches very fast. That's something very hard to tell. And when Gunnar Nelson kind of came out of that first exchange, it looked like a guy that was rocked, not look like a guy that had gotten poked in the eye. However, Ponzinibbio, whether those were intentional or not, I'd like to think they weren't. I think it was just him, just rushing out with his hands forward, which is, again, supposed to be illegal. I don't know if Scotland has the new rules. I don't remember them saying that on the broadcast, but, you could say he got away with a little bit, but at the end of the day, that's part of the fight game. Eye pokes are going to happen sometimes. It's unfortunate, but that's just how it works with open-toe gloves, or open-finger gloves. And as much as the rules, are going to change with guys, keeping a closed fist more, it's just going to happen on occasion. And it's unfortunate that happened in the main event, and what was a big fight, a fight that, was going to put Gunnar Nelson back, into, a nice winning track and back into the close inch in the top 5. However, Ponzinibbio was able to pull a huge upset, and he took advantage of those, and he got the job done. And though I don't think the fight's going to get overturned, maybe it's a fight that gets run back at some point. It's unfortunate for Gunnar. You put all this work and effort into a fight, and you lose on some blows that definitely affected you. And I'm not saying they didn't, but that's just how it goes sometimes. And the referee's not always going to see every single little thing in a fight, and that's kind of the human error that we have here in not just in combat sports, but in all sports, with a human referee. Just some things they're just not going to be able to see. They're maybe just not quite at the right angle, or there just happens too fast that they can't catch it and process it. And it's unfortunate for Gunnar Nelson, but Ponzinibbio did land some hard strikes. I mean, it wasn't just all completely because of eye pokes. I mean, the dude hits hard, and you got to give some credit to Ponzinibbio. He put Gunnar in a bad position, and he put him away before Gunnar was able to recover. Well, that's about it for the show. Thanks, everybody, to watching here live on MMA Fighting Club, and, of course, watching after the fact on YouTube, youtube.com/Beyond the Cage Podcast. I am Jim Graham. You can follow me on Twitter at Jim Graham, just my name. And I'd like to thank everybody who supports Beyond the Cage, MMA UK, the MMA community, AJ Hiller of MMAsignatures.co, top place in the world to get MMA memorabilia, top-rated MMA, Gorilla the Bear, Izzy Garcia, Flying Brian J, MMA Fight Fans on Twitter, and of course MMA Fighting Club for hosting the live stream of the show. So until next week, thank you everybody for listening to another edition of Beyond the Cage.